Thanks, Aaron. And thank you, Colin, and everyone who is here with me today or just present today. Really grateful for this space and to talk a little bit about my work and practice. Um, I know I have a quote up. I will read it out loud. I know it's a little hard to see on the screen, so I apologize for that, but I will read it out loud to you all. It's a bell hooks quote about the gaze, and the reason why I like to start off doing a talk about my work around the gaze is because I really had to take some time to think about the way that I see and also the way that I am seen and perceived and how that comes through with even the way my work is presented. Before I even get into this quote, I usually, when I'm visiting schools and institutions, I like to talk about my journey because I feel like it's quite an interesting one. I actually started out pretty late as an artist. I was an athlete for most of my life, playing basketball. That was my thing, in the way that I found kind of grounding in the world and also how I found community, being a part of teams, traveling and playing. I got to a point where I was somewhat decent at basketball to where I was offered a scholarship to play at a small D1 school in Pennsylvania called Bucknell University. And at that time, my freshman year was, they kind of ask you to join a college of the university that's outside of your declared major, which at that time, my declared major was business. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll do something totally different. I'll look into kind of the art and theater college and see, what I can kind of learn from that. Also, there were trips that they took, I think twice a semester to New York, and me being from the Bronx, it was a perfect opportunity to see my family and also to go back to a space that, felt very familiar to me. So during that first year, my freshman year, playing basketball, I also started taking courses, art history courses, learning about different artists that were working in different mediums. We went through all of the isms, as you all know, and throughout the different centuries of like just learning about the different ways art was continuously evolving, changing, and also being interpreted. Growing up, I didn't really see myself as an artist, didn't really think that this could be kind of the way in which I moved through the world because I didn't feel I had a skill set. I didn't think I could paint, could draw, could sculpt, so art for me felt very inaccessible. It wasn't until I took one art history course where we were learning about contemporary artists, Dan Flavin, Marcel Duchamp, even earlier contemporary artists, just folks that were kind of thinking outside of the box around how we perceive mundane objects and the ways in which they could kind of change that perception by altering its presentation, writing about it in a certain way to adjust and shift the way that we kind of see it and look at it, and also even altering certain parts of the object. And that for me was kind of mind-blowing and really opened up a space for me where I could somewhat see myself kind of entering into that space of creating works that really were focused on how we can change perception and how in that perception we can change narrative. So I was still trying to figure out where do I go from there. And that's where I picked up photography, really got into the dark room, and was really blown away by the ways in which I could create an image and see it kind of change right there in that instance, using certain chemicals. And that's where my journey started. As a freshman in college, really at that point in time, realizing that I could do something in the arts, but still unsure of where that actually led me. Fast forward, graduating Bucknell, I was trying to figure out how art existed in my life. I was doing photography, not necessarily that great at it, I want to point that out as well, but decided to go back to school where I was at SCAD in Atlanta and doing photo classes full time, and really just learning about the craft and really understanding kind of the way I can kind of hold space, with this particular medium. Photography, as some may know, has a very interesting history. While it's a medium and a tool that could be used to tell truth, that could be used to speak to so many different things, that can be used to kind of cultivate a specific narrative. It's also been a tool that has historically misrepresented so many different people and so many different communities, and in a lot of ways has been kind of a violent reinforcement on how we portray or how we see biases and stereotypes being depicted, and how that's projected out into the world. So when I think about this quote by Bell Hooks and I think about the gaze, my entryway into art through photography, through visual media, has been a real defining factor in how I see myself and how I have constantly and continuously currently work to kind of change that perception of the ways in which I am viewed as I navigate space as a Black queer woman. So to read this out loud, Bell Hooks states, "Since I knew as a child that the dominating power adults exercised over me and over my gaze was never as absolute that I did not dare to look, to sneak a peek, to stare dangerously. I knew that the slaves had looked, that all attempts to repress our Black people's right to gaze had reduced in us an overwhelming longing to look, a rebellious desire, an oppositional gaze. By courageously looking, we defiantly declared, not only will I stare, I want my look to change reality." So in everything that I do within my work, moving from photography to working now mainly in performance and video, I'm constantly thinking about the ways in which we see. How can I change perception, not just for myself, but for everyone around me? And how does that change in perception and perspective really alter the way that we all navigate space and alter the way that we all interact and communicate with one another? How does the visual and the way that we kind of look into the visual change the way that we speak? How does that visual become language? And in what ways, in that visual becoming language, does it create an opportunity for us to see ourselves beyond the current reality and create this kind of imaginative space where we can exist beyond what we have been told or how we have been told to exist previously? The first work I want to show you all is a work that's really dear to me. This work was a part of a project I did in 2018 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as part of Art Prize 10. It's called Brown, Carmine, and Blue. During that project, and when you go into the gallery, you'll actually see a neon piece that was also a part of this installation. During this installation, I was really focused on kind of changing my own perspective on how I was processing grief and trauma. When I talk about grief and trauma, a lot of times people want to kind of pigeonhole it to this kind of large event that takes place. But when I think about it as these kind of small acts, these small events that have really informed the way that we kind of see ourselves. And so when I was thinking about the ways that I was processing trauma, a lot of the times I was kind of processing it directly. Before I actually did this work in 2017, I had created a variety of videos that were documenting performance, these gestures from the body that I was doing for a live audience that was documented on video, that were really kind of focusing on these minute details in some really big cases where Black men and women were unjustly murdered, whether it was by police or whether it was by just people that were kind of coming into contact with them and killing them based on just the mere fact that they were Black, and looked at as a threat, unfortunately. And so I was really interested in this work I did in 2017, which I titled Injustice, to really think about the ways in which I could speak to some of those details, and really focus in on the cause and also the effect that a lot of those things had on my life, in kind of really pushing me to understand how trauma existed and how I saw myself, not just in me kind of moving every day in my own life, but also seeing the ways that Blackness was portrayed in visual media. The one thing I took from that work, though, was that, you know, in creating it as an artist, am I just perpetuating this cycle and re-traumatizing my audience? in the same way that I'm processing this trauma in real time through my actions and gestures, by speaking directly to the act, again, am I, just pushing that trauma back out on to someone else and projecting that? So I really had to sit with that, of if I'm creating something, will I also have space to not just talk about the grief and the trauma, but to talk about the things that happen after? When we all kind of go through these things, there's moments where beauty still exists in our life, beauty persists. There's also moments where joy exists in the ways in which we move through the world. How can I speak to those moments as well? And also, how can I speak to the process of getting to that point? There's a process we go through when we're met with something that is filled with grief and trauma. We go through this process of acknowledging it, understanding it, and also caring for it in a way. So how can I talk about those things? So the image that you see here was my way of processing and my way of kind of bringing that conversation into a space. In the installation, I had a multitude of videos. One of the videos is actually playing in the Foundation Gallery, Superwoman, which I'll also play here at the end of this talk. But also a big part of that installation and that work, Brown, Carmine, and Blue, was to do this durational performance for the 2.5 weeks that the project was up. And as you can see in these images, I'm carrying cinder blocks throughout the space. My project space, or install space, as you want to call it, was on the second floor of this abandoned building in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was myself and around 14 other artists that took over this space through an arts kind of collective called Site Lab. I had about 1,200 square feet to work with, and the idea that I wanted to really portray was to lift cinder blocks every other day. Some duration was 4 hours, others 6 hours, sometimes even 8 hours a day, lifting these blocks, bringing them into my space, caring for them, painting them black really slowly, and building these monolithic structures that sometimes were around 7 to 8 feet in height and around 2 to 3 feet in width. The process was not about the act necessarily, or it was about the act. It wasn't about the final realized thing that you saw in that monolithic structure, but it was about how we carry weight silently, the ways in which we're perceived as we're moving through space, carrying this weight. As I was walking through the space with these cinder blocks, seeing people kind of walk by me and not even pay me any mind, but then also seeing people actually stop and look, thinking back to that gaze. The spectacle that becomes of how we take in trauma, how we take in grief, how we take in the weight of another. Also thinking about the ways in which my body adapted and adjusted to the strenuous act. These bricks were about 35 pounds each. I think I lifted over the course of the 2.5 weeks, 300 of them, building these structures throughout the space. So as I was doing this, I remember the first day, walking barefoot, this abandoned building, shards of glass, sometimes inserting themselves into the bottom of my feet, and feeling extremely exhausted by the end of the first day, and only lifting 12 blocks that first day. By the end of the 2.5 weeks, I had got to a point where I was lifting 26 blocks, and thinking about the ways in which our body adjusts to carrying and holding weight, grief, trauma, and the ways in which our body adjusts to protect us and to hold space for the things maybe that we don't have to hold space for, but there's no other way. So our body has to do this as a way to make sure that we remain okay and that we're able to kind of still move on and progress and exist as we do in life. And so those are things that I took with me from this project. Thinking about this simple gesture that I was doing, speaking to this very intensive process, and how I was starting to understand the ways in which weight existed in my own body, the importance of acknowledging it, caring for it, and releasing it. And in that release, really seeing the profound nature that it had on my existence. This image here is a recreation of one of the monolithic structures that I would have created in 2018. This was recreated last summer. at my gallery Marlborough for a summer show I did there. And in it, I really started to think about the ways in which the original act was somewhat of a spectacle. You know, this pain that I was going through, it was being spectated on. There was this really interesting power dynamic, power structure that was at play, even though internally I was processing and going through all of these different emotions. In the external space, there were people who were just kind of looking and not necessarily understanding the way that weight was existing within. And so I really wanted to question, how do I move forward with this work, still honoring the act, honoring the way that my body was processing this simple act and gesture, and being able to bring that into a new space without bringing that spectacle, without bringing that external gaze that could sometimes kind of create this power dynamic where things can become unsafe in how you see yourself. And so with this piece, I wanted to recreate the structure, but instead I decided to actually do the act of building it in the privacy of my own space, putting contact mics all over my body, and creating a soundscape that really enveloped the piece. So as you walk around it, you hear kind of the chipping away, the kind of bricks being slid and stacked continuously over and over. This simple gesture and sound, but a way to give you access and entry into the process to build this structure, and into the process it took, the labor that it took to get to this point of realization around the weight that this structure holds and the weight that grief and trauma holds. So in a lot of my work, I'm constantly thinking about gesture as an act of speaking and voicing. I'm thinking about sound also as an act of speaking and voicing, actual language as an act of talking, and voicing thoughts and opinions and truths within. But the main thing that I'm really, really focused on is again, how like language exists to shift, and how in that existence, language can really, really push us to understand the ways in which we're seeing, the ways in which we're experiencing. This work in particular is really focused on gesture. To explain briefly, a lot of my work, I'm also thinking about the ways in which language, gesture, movement, etc., kind of exist to liberate. I think a lot of times when we try to connect to our true selves, we are restricted by thought. We sometimes allow our brains to kind of trick us into not trusting our body to do what's best for us. This piece was about kind of countering that. So I put in my studio space linen canvases all over the walls. I had a playlist that was playing that my mother curated of different jazz music that we would listen to since I was a child. And the main kind of parameter that I placed in front of me was to not stop moving, to allow myself to move freely, to not think about what the movements would produce, what the movements would be, but just to move. And so I would douse myself with blue paint and literally feel the rhythm of the sounds that were coming from that playlist, and just my body would kind of just move with it. And what became of it was these paintings. And this was actually the first time that I was called a painter, but I'm not gonna take that on today. You'll see two of these in the Foundation Gallery. The interesting thing about these works is it comes directly from the body, and something I really enjoy about the ways I'm thinking about my work and practice is thinking about the way the body becomes almost a medium, a vessel to speak, and in that speaking, how we can communicate without language, but only with movement and gesture, and sometimes even with silence as you're kind of taking this in and really understanding the way that the gestures as a remnant are speaking to you. I want to talk about this piece because this piece is specifically about movement, not necessarily in the actual physical sense, but movement when we think about the spiritual element of it. Last summer, I got invited to do open call at the Shed in New York, where you have a beautiful opportunity to create a commissioned piece. I had this idea, a lot of my practice when I think about what is of influence, jazz music is definitely of influence, sound in general, music in general, but also poetry, because I think both of those have this style of abstraction that I feel is very resonant with the ways in which I work and the ways in which I process. And so I was noticing when I listened to a lot of jazz music, black house music, and also gospel music, there were these hints of sound and rhythms that felt so familiar and that would kind of thread line throughout. And I started doing research on a specific tradition, specifically in Western Africa, the Nawa. They would do these rituals using specific corded instruments, stringed instruments, horns, etc. And I remember listening to some of the sounds that would come from these rituals and these experiences, past and present, and hearing the sounds that I felt so very familiar with from the jazz and house and blues and gospel music that I grew up with and that is still present in my life and of huge influence to my practice. And so I really wanted to kind of do research on what were the instruments being used and in what ways could I create my own instruments or maybe find those instruments and start creating my own sounds to respond to. And so what came of this was me having these kind of musical sessions. So this is my point where I turn into a musician, where I was creating these kind of abstracted sounds using different instruments, and also adding in sourced kind of sound that was maybe not necessarily from an instrument, but very resonant to what you would kind of feel familiar with in regards to different kind of instruments that you hear. And I put together this soundscape that was around 14 minutes long. And in the soundscape, that was the reference point. So this piece was about, in the same way that I kind of created the paintings from the body, this piece was about how can I move freely to the actual act of listening to sound and rhythm in real time. So the sound became the original reference, the creation of that. And then I played the sound in my personal space and started creating visuals where I was filming myself at different angles, maybe parts just my hand, my shoulder, my back, my torso, and even my face and my mouth, and the ways in which my neck and my face would kind of move to certain rhythms and sounds that were coming through the soundscape that I created. So this became a call and response in real time. And the idea of this piece and the way I presented it was to, in the space, also kind of activate the viewer and the audience. I think a lot of times when we are kind of taking in media, visual media, we're very stagnant in our experience. And so I wanted to kind of change that perception. I don't want the viewer to be stagnant. I want the viewer to be an active witness and participant in the work as well. So as you can see in this image, the viewer is kind of pushed to kind of enter into the center of the space, and they're seeing the visuals in the round, and the visuals are kind of moving through this kind of soundscape. And you as the viewer, in order to kind of take in the piece, you also have to move with it. So not only am I as the artist doing a call and response, but you as the viewer are also activated to do a call and response to what you're physically seeing in real time. And this piece for me felt very important in regards to a shift in the way I have been thinking about my work. Obviously thinking about this kind of liberated movement, the ways that we kind of remove thought from our processing. How do I kind of activate that also in the audience, in the viewer? How do I kind of create these moments of, whether it's silence, these moments of actual physical movement, or even these moments where your perception is changed to where your body is actually flowing and moving in ways that you did not necessarily think about. This also happens in this piece, Maybe Rainbows Do Exist at Night. This piece I did in 2019 prior to the last piece you saw, There's No Movement Without Rhythm. And this piece was more so about this kind of tug and pull with freedom, I remember I kept asking myself this question before I created this work: what does free look like? What does free feel like? How can I embody freedom? And it became this tug and pull in trying to answer that. You know, I think we get to a point where we understand what it will take to fully feel free in our bodies and in our existence on a day-to-day, but what is projected onto us is a way to kind of continue to condition us to move away from that actual act of liberating. And so in this piece, I go through this kind of tug and pull through that, really thinking through the ways in which my body exists in a space when I actually feel this sense of freedom, and the ways in which I'm pulled back into a space of not really entering into that because of the ways I've been conditioned to see myself. So I want to show a piece, an actual video piece from this particular 6-channel work, to give you a little bit of context about how you would experience it in the whole. Right now, you're looking at an image of 6 monitors that are fully activated. Right after this full activation of the 6 monitors, the center monitor that you see here is actually becomes siloed, and there's this one visual that kind of brings you in. So all of the other monitors become black, or as I like to say, silent. Really forcing you as a viewer to kind of step into this space. And you'll see in the video that I show you, you're stepping into a gaze where I'm looking directly at you. And you have to kind of question and ponder how your own presence and existence in the space is also activated in that moment. When thinking about this work, again, I'm thinking about the ways in which movement, gesture can activate the audience, as well as activating myself, but also the ways in which silence can be a part of that. This moment coming from this full activation where you're seeing these symbols of freedom that exist all around us, these red, white, and blue, how we understand what it's like to live in America, supposedly the land of the free, but how that's only given to some. And in the final, in the move to this kind of siloed clip that you'll see here in a second, really considering and questioning the ways in which that freedom exists for someone like myself, not necessarily in this kind of lighted space where it's seen clearly, but sometimes in the dark, where I have to do the work myself to fully feel free and liberated from all of the things around me. So there's a few things that happen in this piece, in this work. Is there's a moment where there's silence at the beginning and silence at the end, which is putting back onto the viewer a questioning. When you don't hear anything, are you allowing yourself to really still be present? Are you questioning why it isn't easy for you to take in what you're experiencing? I think a lot of times we expect certain things to exist in a certain way. We expect sound when we actually see someone's mouth moving. When something starts, we also kind of expect the sound to follow. And so by me kind of refusing that for you as a viewer and an audience, and not giving you this kind of palatable experience, what is that pushing in you? Is that a place of discomfort where you exist? And in me kind of maybe placing that discomfort on you, are you able to understand the ways in which I've had to exist in that discomfort as well? Also, another thing that happens is as you saw the end where the music kind of stops and there's silence in the scream, thinking about the ways in which Black trauma has been highly consumed or heavily consumed. And then in that consumption, kind of used against us. I think about the ways in which this kind of exertion of rage is actually a beautiful act when you think about it, because it's a release, and it allows for, in that release, for you to kind of take in other things, other ways of being and seeing and considering emotions. But it's been used as a way to violently depict Blackness as something that is kind of engulfed by rage. But in the beauty of it, rage is actually a love language, I feel like, to the ways that we experience Blackness. It's actually a way that we uphold how important it is to destroy the ways that we have existed, how we've seen kind of the world exist, and build back up from that. And so for me, rage exists as this powerful act of love and this powerful act of care. And so in that moment where I'm expressing that rage, I'm not allowing you access into what that feeling is like for me. I'm holding back, I'm refusing giving that to you by muting the sound in that moment. So for you to kind of question, maybe how you consume that in your own life, and how you kind of take that in your own life. So a lot of the work that I'm creating, I'm also thinking about, like, again, with this idea of gaze, changing those power dynamics and also pushing these questions back onto the audience and to the viewer. And I think a lot about the song choice. A lot of the times I'm really thinking about the words and excavating the meaning of the words. That song by Sun Ra, When There Is No Sun, he continuously says, the sky is a sea of darkness when there is no sun, when there is no sun to light the way. Eternal sea of darkness, eternal sea of darkness. So again, going back to this questioning of the ways in which this processing has to exist in the absence of light, the ways in which the work that's done to get to this point of feeling liberated and unraveling this conditioning has to be done in the dark, has to be done alone. Is kind of the only way that it can happen. So even the titling of this piece and the work that was a part of this exhibition, Maybe Rainbows Do Exist at Night, is a questioning of how that work that's done in the absence of light can become work that's beautiful and work that is considered a phenomena. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this piece, There Are Other Hues of Blue. This piece specifically speaking to my kind of work in language, like actual, like audible language, not just visual language, and the ways in which that has also been a liberating act for me in my practice. This piece means so much to me. It's actually one that started off as a durational performance. And just to give you a little bit of info about kind of how it became. Since 2012, I have been writing kind of statements. I haven't really thought of myself as a poet, but I do write a lot of poetry. And I do write words down as a way to process in moments where I'm feeling extreme emotions. And so from 2012, I had been carrying notebooks around. I always have a notebook on me. And if I don't have my notebook, I have my phone where I'm like writing things in my notes app. And I noticed from 2012, I started gathering, in 2019, I started gathering all of my notebooks together and even the notes from my phone from like past years and really looking at the words that I was writing. Sometimes it was literally just one word. Sometimes it was just one sentence. Sometimes it was a full statement. And usually, most of the time when I was writing these words, it was in moments when I was feeling extreme emotions, whether it was anger, whether it was sadness, whether it was absolute joy. It was always times where I had these extreme emotions happening. And so I started pulling these kind of notes together, realizing there was a rhythm that was present in the words and the way that they function as a whole. So I decided I wanted to kind of piece them together to create almost like a reading, which became There Are Other Hues of Blue. The first time I did the reading was in 2019 at a gallery called Microscope in Brooklyn. And I wanted to create a space where I could speak freely. This was my first time doing a performance where it wasn't just focused on gesture and movement, but the first time I was actually using voice as a part of the actual performative act. And so I remember thinking about like how vulnerable that is to speak something that is coming from the depths of your emotional truth. How vulnerable that is to do that in a space. And I remember telling myself, I cannot literally stand in front of a crowd and look at this crowd and speak these words. So in what ways can I create a space where I am honoring my body, honoring my voice, and honoring my experience, and allowing for that vulnerability to exist without feeling fear of harm or judgment or even a projection onto the ways people want to see me. So in that, I decided to kind of create a barrier. So as you can see in this image, every time I read these words out loud, I would have my back to the audience, to the viewer, as a way to kind of create space so I could speak those words out loud, but to myself. And this became interesting because it was basically me kind of creating an environment for myself where those words existed without any type of restriction on how they were spoken out loud and also how they existed after they were spoken. This was a 75-minute piece the first time I did it, which is a very long time to speak, and I was speaking consistently and constantly. I did this piece maybe 5 or 6 times that year, traveling to different areas, setting this kind of blue space up with my back towards the crowd and just reading freely. Beautiful experience, but also emotionally and physically taxing on the body. So I started thinking about ways in which this work could exist without my physical presence. And then obviously the pandemic hit in 2020. And that question actually became a reality. How can this work exist without me actually being in a physical space and able to kind of voice and speak out loud these words? And so what became of this was an installation that I created. So this moved from a durational performance to a multi-channel video piece, thinking about the way that the sound could be displayed in the space, but also thinking about what visual could aid this work, what visual could be right next to the actual audio component of this piece. So the visuals that you see, just to give you kind of a quick background, obviously in 2020, not only were we dealing with the beginning of the pandemic, but that is a year when there were uprisings across the US and also across the world based on a video that went viral of George Floyd, unfortunately, being murdered by police. During those uprisings, there was a lot of talk around, obviously, George Floyd's death. And then also Breonna Taylor was another person that continuously came up in conversations and protests and in the uprisings. But there was one gentleman that I had the unfortunate experience of witnessing his death on Facebook Live. This was actually during, at the height of the uprisings. I remember coming home from a rally in the city, literally almost being beat by police at that rally, feeling physically exhausted. I remember crying, like as I was sitting. And I was going online on Facebook to just check in on what events were taking place in community where I could just feel held by people around me. And as I opened the app, there was a video that popped up, and I see a young man on Facebook Live kind of running this kind of shaky video. And as I'm watching it, you see the camera drop. And at that moment, I realized that he had been shot. And Facebook Live is a very weird experience because as you're watching the video, you're seeing all of these emojis kind of pop up on the screen. You're seeing people typing in comments, some people laughing, some people questioning what is happening, hearts, smiley face emojis happening on screen as you're watching. And then you also hear the audio, and in the audio, you actually hear the cops surrounding his body and speaking in such a degrading way about the way his body laid. I remember in that moment of watching the video, a sensation of just heat overtaking my body feeling overheated. I remember behind my ears, it feeling like they were just flames that were just kind of erupting. And I remember sitting with that. And for some odd reason, the video decided to refresh and replay. And in the replay, as the act happened and the phone falls to the ground, the front camera is obviously looking up at this blue sky, which was just the clearest blue you can imagine. And I remember instead of focusing on all these emojis that are coming up, there was a moment where the sun hits the front lens of the camera and creates this really interesting lens flare. In the top right-hand corner, you see the blues that are clear kind of shifting in color, turning into blues and purples and greens and even yellows. And this happened for about 20 seconds, but I remember being transfixed on that moment and feeling all of that heat and fire that was in my body just release. And I remember feeling my body kind of feel weightless and at peace. And I started thinking about that experience of the ways in which we can experience trauma and tragedy in real time. And for some reason, there's always this moment where beauty can persist. And in that persistence, what can we take from that, and how can that become kind of this transcending moment, in this moment where we kind of transform our rage and our anger into something beautiful that we can then give to the world? And so I started thinking about my words, from There Are Other Hues of Blue, and the ways in which that could also exist with this moment. So I decided to take that small 15 to 20 second clip in the top right-hand corner, screen grab it, bring it into post, and slow it down to about 1%. So when you slow it down in post, if anyone knows about editing, it's like these very like clips that are just like kind of stagnant frames. And what I wanted to do was add life to it, add my hand in it, add breath to it. And so I added this kind of white transition that moves you through all of these different hues of blue that you're experiencing in this slowness of the slowing down of that 15 to 20 seconds. And in that slowing down, what took place was the 15 to 20 seconds transformed into about an hour of footage. So when you walked into the space of this installation, There Are Other Hues of Blue starting off as this durational performance and then turning into this installation. You're hearing the audio from my words read out loud from There Are Other Hues of Blue, the language from the piece. And then you're experiencing this visual where the screens are just kind of moving and breathing through these hues of blues continuously for a full hour and 3 minutes. The thing about this work is that, there's no way I could take full kind of ownership over how someone experiences it. I've seen people walk into this space, see a blue screen, and think it was nothing, and leave. And I've actually seen people who saw this blue really became transfixed in the way I became transfixed on that moment, and really move through the visual and the language and the words and have a moment and an experience. And so, again, the work is not necessarily about trying to put something on someone or place an experience on someone. It's about questioning how you see, how you take in, how you allow yourself to go deeper into what an experience can be for you, into how transformational an experience can be if you really just allow yourself to unravel what you're looking at. And so I want to play like a small clip from the piece. It's an intro, about 4.5 minutes, just to give you all an idea of what you would have experienced if you saw this in real time. And at night, blue water evokes the depths of darkness. But if you were to fall in, I promised the light from the sky would seep through, and the very waters that you once thought were dark would become opaque. Somewhat similar to how I view myself, dark, yet receptive of light. And as the sun comes up, I rise, water whipping against my face, refreshed, the sun blinding my sight, recharged, the blues squinting back at me. And as night comes again, my eyes adjust to see. There are other hues of blue. There are other hues of blue. So that was the intro of that work, There Are Other Hues of Blue. Um, Again, a work that is primarily about the ways that we honor in existence, in presence, but also in absence, in the power in that honoring through visual and through audio. Another piece I want to talk about, and I know I'm running low on time, so I have like maybe 4 more works I'll speak on, is a piece titled Breathing, in this kind of continuation of thinking around language and the ways that language can open up this act of fully liberating self. The second slide, I showed you all a work around cinder blocks and this monolithic structure that I created. During that same show, I decided to do a performance where I performed for 10 days straight in the space. Each one of those days, I would take one of the cinder blocks from that structure, put it somewhere in the space, and stand on top of it for 2 hours straight. And I had a passage that I had written that was 2 pages front and back, or 1 page, excuse me, front and back. And that passage, before I even did the actual act of performing this live, I have this writing process where I'll kind of write something out, like stream of thought, no restrictions, just writing to write. And then in that writing, I'll read it out loud once I'm done. And when I read it out loud, I think about the words, the specific words that kind of hit my body at certain moments. So for instance, if I'm saying the river went dry, the river went dry, maybe it's went that's hitting my body in a certain way, and so I'll underline that word. And so as I'm reading, I'm also underlining. So it becomes 3 passages, actually. It becomes the full passage, it becomes the underlined words as a passage, and then it becomes the words that are not underlined that also become a passage. And so I'm thinking really about the ways in which language can exist in multitudes and how we can abstract that. So during the reading, the parameter that I set was to just read without stopping, to read continuously, not allowing myself to stop speaking for those full 2 hours. In that, my words became breath. In that, my words became song. In that, my words became a chant of sorts. And as you can tell, standing on top of a cinder block for 2 hours is not the most fun thing you can do during the day. And so there was a lot of pain involved. I remember my lower half of my body each day just becoming numb. So when I am not allowed to feel myself physically grounded in the space, like how can my breath ground me? And so my breath became a grounding practice to allowing myself to stay up. Not just my physical presence being kind of uplifted, but also my voice and my words being uplifted. And so this act, this performance, Breathing, became really beautiful because for me it was a way to kind of really, really remove these barriers I think we have to how we kind of enter into this spiritual space and really get to a place of like truly understanding the ways in which our spirit can be activated and navigated in that activation. Another piece I wanted to talk about that feels a little similar to that is thinking about the ways in which we kind of honor this symbol of honoring, and the ways in which that honoring kind of creates a place for us to really see someone in their true existence. So I created this sculpture that was also kind of in tandem with the paintings, the blue paintings that I did with my body, where I was kind of freely moving, wanting to create a portrait. My Black mother birthed me into the blues, thinking about the ways in which existence can be painful, the ways in which we understand how giving new life, new birth into the world can be a painful act, but also one of beauty. Thinking also about the way my mom may have processed that, and knowing that, as I was born into myself, that she would have to love me through all of the things I would experience that align with kind of this, tragedy and trauma, just based on the ways that I identified. And so thinking about how we can create visual language for that and honor the folks who have kind of affirmed and supported and uplifted us in the same ways that we, through gesture, movement, voice, also affirm and uplift ourselves. And then the last two pieces I want to talk about, also speaking to language again, but thinking about the ways in which we honor release, we honor this act of moving into a new space with ourselves. I'll call it rebirth of sorts. I created this piece called Libere, where I'm really kind of questioning how you're kind of experiencing the piece, seeing the piece, but also experiencing yourself being activated with the piece. As you can see in this image here on the left, as you kind of walk towards the piece, the word libere is something that you cannot read. You have to walk up to the piece, as you see in the image on the right, and actually look down into this pool of reflection of water and see the piece kind of laid out in that reflection, and also in seeing that word laid out and actually finally being able to read it out loud, you're also seeing an image of yourself. And so it's a question of what does the word libere mean? It means release in French, but also a question of what are you releasing in this moment of entering into this space, of entering into the work, and of actually feeling your presence with the work as well. And also thinking about what are we all kind of releasing on a day-to-day. I wanted to end with this piece because I think it's a consistent, I like to call it a love letter to myself. Thinking about the ways in which we go through this process of birthing into a new. I usually have this phrase that I say every day. It's kind of like a mantra that we die every day. Parts of ourselves die off every day so that new parts of self could exist and kind of be birthed into. And so in this video, Superwoman, which you'll see in the Foundation Gallery, but I want to play it for you all here right now, you see this baptism, this self-baptism happening, where I'm doing the self-baptism, the act happens, and I kind of run away from camera. And then there's this moment where you see me kind of coming backwards, where everything that I had just done is being undone and reversed. And so it's this thought of, in what ways are we honoring the experience of becoming? In what ways are we honoring the experience of life and living and existing? You know, we all are flawed, but we all have these unique ways of being that are really quite beautiful. And in what ways are we honoring the ways that we are moving into this progressive self, but also at times we may fall back to where we had just came from. And I think a lot of times, I know for myself, which is why I say this is a love letter to myself, I tend to get really hard on myself about the ways in which I revert back to certain cycles and certain ways of being that could be harmful for the ways that I want to progress and see myself in this kind of higher light. And this work is about honoring that process, honoring the ways in which we may fail, honoring the ways in which we may fall back into old habits and old ways of being, but also realizing that that's a part of life and that's the beauty of living. And so I want to play this piece. It's about 6.5 minutes, or 6 minutes and 48 seconds exactly, to give you all an idea of that process. And every time I look at this piece again, I look at it as a love letter to myself, because it's a continuous reminder that even if I do fail, I can still continue to move forward. Failure does not always mean a setback. It can also mean a way you can kind of put things in motion to move forward and continue on.
from the black pool of genius. We'd like to give you our rendition of Stevie Wonder's Superwoman. When the summer came, you were not around. Now the summer's gone and love cannot be found. Where were you when I needed you? Last winter, my love. When the winter came, you went further south, parting from love's nest and leaving me in doubt. Where are you when I need you? Like right now. Our love is at an end. Though you say now you have changed, but tomorrow will be glad. Love's bad, love's bad. Till the winter came, you were not around. Through the bitter winds, love could not be found. Where were you when I needed you? Last winter, my dear, my dear, my baby, my love. Have changed, but tomorrow will be glad. Love's spring will fill the air, and you will come around.
Thank you all.